The topic is kaparos, which I suppose everyone is familiar with. You take a chicken, whirl it around your head, you say some verses, and is this a kosher practice, or is this just some kind of superstition that we should do our best to avoid? Now, investigating this question is going to give us an opportunity to understand what the great rabbis over the generations have had to say about superstition. We'll see how the rabbis define what is and what is not superstition, and what is and what is not permissible or prohibited practice. Let's see if I can succeed in getting the sources on the screen. I think I did it. Voila, I think I did it. These are the sources. They should have been distributed by email. I hope you got them. First, we're going to have to deal with the general issue of what is superstition and to what extent it is permitted or prohibited. After that, we'll be able to take these principles and apply them to the specific example of kaparos. The whole story begins with a verse in the Torah, "B'chukotehem lo telechu." When the Bnei Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael, there's a commandment, one of the 613 commandments, not to imitate their ways, not to imitate their way of doing things. The Canaanites, just because they do something, doesn't mean you should do it. Indeed, if it's just copying them, it's prohibited to just copy what they do. Now, this requires a definition. After all, a lot of what we do is remarkably similar to what the Gentiles around us do, what's permitted and what's prohibited. Well, let's see the approach of the poskim to this issue. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and as usual, I don't have to tell you exactly where I draw the sources from because you have that on the screen if you want to check out my typographical errors and see the context of the source. But what it says in the Gemara is Sreifa al Hamet, burning the property of someone who dies. Burning the property of someone who dies. Well, you know, this was quite common in North America among the native inhabitants of North America, in the Northwest particularly. It was quite common it was quite common in India. I suppose everyone has read Around the World in 80 Days. When someone dies, you burn his property with him, never her property. Always you burn his property with him. And in the case of Around the World in 80 Days, since you're burning all of his property, you put his wives on the fire as well, burn them as well. Now, the Gemara says that the practice of burning someone's property after he has died, lav chukah d'avodah zarah, it's not an idolatrous practice. It's okay. The Gemara is giving its approval to burning the property of the deceased. Why? Ella chashivusahi. It's a question of chashivut. It's a way of honoring the deceased. It's a way of expressing respect and honor for the deceased. And therefore, since there's a good reason to do it, namely honoring the deceased, it's okay. It's not considered an idolatrous practice. Now, the Tosafot on that passage in the Gemara develops the underlying rules. These are the words of the Tosafot. Tre gavne havu. There are two categories of prohibited activities which are prohibited because they are imitative, they're imitating non-Jewish ways. Two categories of non-Jewish conduct that we are not allowed to imitate. Okay, what are the two categories of non-Jewish practices that we are prohibited from embracing. We are prohibited from following ourselves. Echad, Tosafot says, the first category of prohibited practices, she'osim l'shem chok avodas kochavim, anything which they do, which is associated with their idolatry. And of course, all different religions all over the world have different practices. Whatever their idolatrous practice happens to be, we are not allowed to imitate. Okay, well, nowadays, there's not nearly as much avodah zarah in the world as there was back then. And therefore, this is usually not going to be a problem. If you're traveling in Southeast Asia, where idolatry is still alive and well, or in southern Asia, Africa, there are places in the world where idolatry is alive and well, and they have their practices. Well, as cool as it might seem, we are not allowed to imitate what they do. That's the point of the Tosafot. Notice in passing that I'm not discussing a big issue here. The big issue I am not discussing is whether or not the practices of Islam and the practices of Christianity are considered to be idolatrous. That's a big question, which we're not going to get into today. That deserves a separate class all by itself at some point in the future. We might get to that if there's interest. Okay, according to the Tosafot, the first category of prohibited practices are things which they, the non-Jews, do in connection with their idolatry. The other category, the second category of prohibited activities, she'osim l'shem dat hevel v'shtus shelahem, anything which they do that is stupid, anything which they do that is senseless, any irrational, any senseless, stupid practice that they have, no rational reason for it, that is called superstition, and that we are not allowed to imitate. They burn the property of the deceased. Are we allowed to imitate that? Yes, we are, because there's a rational reason why we are doing it, in order to honor the deceased. And honoring the deceased makes perfect sense, and therefore we are allowed to do it. But anything which they do, which is senseless, anything which they do, which has no apparent reason to it, anything which they do, which is irrational, we are not allowed to imitate. Now, of course, intelligent people can disagree about what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. I'll give you my favorite example of that. There were some students back in the days when Reb Soloveitchik was the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University. There were some students who were studying judo, East Asian martial arts. And their teacher told them that at the beginning and the end of each session, the students have to bow down. Well, when the students heard that, they went to Rav Soloveitchik, the Rosh Yeshiva, and asked him, are we allowed to do that, the practice of bowing down at the beginning and end of each session? To which he said, prohibited. You're not allowed to do it. The next day, the students came back to him and asked, when you told us that it's prohibited to bow down, is that because it's idolatrous? Is that because bowing down is an element of idolatry? To which the Rav Soloveitchik answered, no, that's not the reason. The reason you're prohibited from bowing down at the beginning and end of each judo session is because it is stupid. Well, that's exactly this Tosafot. Now, of course, intelligent people can disagree about what is stupid and what isn't. Someone might might make the claim, someone might want to argue that bowing down at the beginning and end of the judo session is an expression of honor and respect for the other students and for the teacher, in which case it is perfectly rational. Well, people might disagree about what is silly, what is stupid, what is reasonable, and what is not. If you have no rational explanation for a non-Jewish practice, then there's a Torah prohibition for us to imitate it. Well, here we have two categories. And the Gemara concludes, Sreifa lav chukahi l'shem avodas kochavim, makol makom hi hevel v'shtus. It's true, the Gemara concludes, that burning the property of the deceased might not be connected with idolatry, but it is pretty stupid. It is stupid to do. When are we allowed to do it, since it is foolish to burn the property of the deceased? Well, the answer is lo gamrinin minahu iksiva b'daraisa. Since burning the property of the kings of Israel is mentioned in Nach, since Nach mentions the burning of the property of the kings of Israel when they die, so if we do it today, we're not doing it in imitation of the non-Jews. We're doing it because it's referenced in Tanakh. Well, this gives us the important rule. A practice which is senseless, stupid, irrational, superstitious, choose whatever term you wish, if we are doing it because we learned from the non-Jews how to do it, prohibited. If we're doing it because there's a Jewish source for it, for example, in Nach, then that's fine, even though it's silly, even though it's rational, since there is a Torah source for it, namely in Nach in this case, that makes it okay. After all, there are many things in Torah which are chukim, things for which we have no rational explanation. Everyone knows that the mitzvahs of the Torah divide into several categories. Some mitzvahs of the Torah are so reasonable and rational, we would have figured them out by ourselves, even if the Torah had not commanded us. But there is also a category of mitzvahs in the Torah, like para aduma, which defy rational explanation. There are plenty of things in the Torah which defy rational explanation. Burning the property of the deceased, if the reason you're doing it is because you learned about it in Nach, go for it, that's permitted. If the reason you're doing it is because you learned from the Gentiles and you want to imitate their ways, prohibited. Now, Rav Ovadia Yosef in the Yabia Omer points out that in order to have something, in order for a practice to have a Jewish source, we're talking about kol minhag sheniskar b'chazal. It doesn't need a source to be legitimate. The practice, the minhag, the practice does not need a source in Chumash, Nevi'im, or Ksuvim. It's enough if there's a source in Chazal. As long as the source is rabbinic, is Jewish, then the prohibition of superstition is lifted. If there is no minhagim kedumim, if there are no ancient Jewish sources for the minhag, then it is prohibited. That's the point. That's the point of the Tosafot. So what do we have so far? Two important principles. Number one, anything which smacks of idolatry, of avodah zarah, is prohibited. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And anything which is senseless, anything which is silly, anything for which we have no rational explanation is prohibited if it comes from the Gentiles. If, on the other hand, there's a Jewish source for it, then even though it's a superstitious practice, it's permitted. That's the Tosafot. Now we come to Rav Yosef Kolon, the Maharik. He's usually called the Maharik, Renaissance Italy. It's this opinion that we're about to quote, which is repeated over and over again in the great Acharonim, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and the list of great Acharonim who rely upon the Maharik. We're about to learn. It's a very long list. Maharik also says there are two categories of prohibited practices. What are the two categories of prohibited practices? Similar, but not exactly the same as what we learned previously from the Tosafot. Ahad, the first category of prohibited activities, hu davar asher ein ta'amo nigle, anything which has no rational explanation to it, anything which is unreasonable, anything which makes no sense. Kidamash malashon chok, it says in the Torah, chok is that category of things for which we have no rational explanation, and some of the mitzvahs fall into that category, like para aduma. But if it's a chok of the non-Jews, something which they do, which has no rational explanation, which is silly, well, they are doing it, hu gezerat hamelech, ein tam l'davar, anything which we do, anything which we Jews do in terms of mitzvahs, which is a chok, any unexplained practice that we Jews do, we do it because HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us. There might be a reason, but we don't know the reason. All we know is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands us to do it, even though the reason is unknown. If it's the non-Jews who are doing something for which we have no rational explanation, and we are not allowed to copy that. Therefore, anyone who does anything mishuneh, any weird practice, she'ein bo tam nigla, which has no apparent reason for it, just something which the non-Jews do, that is prohibited because it's like you're being drawn into Gentile practices. It's like you're being drawn into Gentile culture, and that's the reason why the Torah prohibits it. Why on earth would you do a weird practice similar to the non-Jews unless you are being assimilated into non-Jewish culture? Okay, according to the Maharik, the first category, very similar to what the Tosafot told us, is anything which has no rational explanation to it. The second category of prohibited activities, now we're coming to a category which is significantly different from what the Tosafot said. Hu davar asher shayach bo nidnud pritzut, gedrat tzniut v'anava. Anything which violates, anything which even a little bit nidnud, anything which just smacks of, anything which is a smidgen, in a violation against modesty, anything which is even slightly immodest is prohibited if we are copying it from the non-Jews. That's what it says in the Torah. You're not allowed to do what they do if there's even the slightest element of immodesty. The immodest practices which are prohibited here fall into two categories also. After all, the immodesty has to do with conduct which is lewd or promiscuous. That's one category of immodesty. But immodesty also has to do with behavior which is unrelated to anything that might be lewd, but is still putting oneself forward in an immodest way. Let me give you the single underlying concept of modesty throughout the length and breadth of Torah. The single concept which can be used as a guide to everything in the length and breadth of Torah, b'chol Torah kula, anything which is prohibited because of immodesty. Here comes the rule. A practice of immodesty, an act of behavior, behaving in an immodest way, is a behavior which focuses people's attention upon you. Anything you do which focuses everyone's attention upon you, that is immodest. Of course, much of this have to do with exposing parts of the body which are normally covered, but one can be fully dressed in an entirely proper way and still attract everyone's attention if you are in the wrong context. For example, a kala, a bride who has a lovely wedding gown, if she's in the wedding hall, well, that's exactly what everyone expects. On the other hand, the same woman dressed in the same wedding gown who's on the tram during rush hour is going to attract everyone's attention. Everyone's going to stare at her. Why is she dressed in a wedding gown? That's really weird. And therefore, it's immodest because she will attract everyone's attention. Now, let's look at it the other way around. A man who is dressed in an ordinary three-piece suit while walking down the street in the financial district downtown is perfectly normal and will not attract a second glance. Take the same man dressed in the same three-piece suit and put him on the beach where everyone is swimming, and everyone's going to stare at that weird behavior. Why on earth is he wearing a three-piece suit with leather shoes on the beach? Well, anything which focuses people's attention upon you, either because there's an element of lewdness or because it's just unusual conduct, that's immodest and that's prohibited according to the second principle of the Ma'arik. Now, this led the Shulchan Aruch to many specific conclusions, but you know, what's perfectly normal and expected in one place and time and does not deserve a second glance, in another place and time, exactly the same conduct might be bizarre and is going to attract everyone's attention. I'll give you the example of the Shulchan Aruch, and then I'll give you a more modern example. Back in the old days, in the days of the Shulchan Aruch, we're talking about the 16th century, Shulchan Aruch says flat out that women are not allowed to wear red garments. A woman wearing a red garment is immodest. And indeed, back in those days where this was simply not done, the woman who appears in public with a red garment is going to attract everyone's attention. Everyone will stare at her, and that's no good. One could easily imagine another place in time where wearing red garments is commonplace and therefore does not deserve a second glance and does not focus people's attention upon you. Let me give you my favorite example of this. Not so long ago, I was a young yeshiva student. I'm not that old, and therefore we're not talking about not so many years ago. And I was a yeshiva student in Yerushalayim. Went to the Mir Yeshiva, which is in Beit Yisrael, right on the border of Mea Shearim. And back in those days, talking about the 1960s, back in those days, from women, girls and women in the Mea Shearim neighborhood, of course, wore black stockings. That was very important for their modesty. Their legs were encased in black stockings. That's what they wore, which I found interesting. Then on a trip abroad, I find myself in Amsterdam, capital of Holland. Now, back in those days, back in the 1960s, there was one kosher restaurant in Amsterdam, Myers Kosher Restaurant. And this was before the days of GPS, before the days of smartphones. We used to have something called paper maps. Sort of like a map, but printed on a piece of paper, and you would carry it with you and try to figure out where you are based on the map. And I got lost. And it turns out that the restaurant I was looking for happens to be right on the border of Amsterdam's red light district. I knew I was walking through a red light district, not only because there were red lights at many doorways, but because I saw many signs next to windows written in Dutch, the local language, a language which I happen to know, signs advertising kamer te huur, room to rent, kamer te huur, room to rent. And next to the sign would be a big window, a lady sitting in the window, and occasionally a man would enter the room, a curtain would go down. A few minutes later, the curtain would go up and the man would leave. So now I understood that the rooms were to rent only for a very brief time. And not all of the professional women in that neighborhood had a kamer te huur. Not all of them had a show window, a show window where they could stand behind in their ground floor rooms. And therefore, in order to identify the women who were professionals walking in the street, those women were wearing black stockings. A woman wearing black stockings in Amsterdam was advertising herself as having a room to rent for a very brief time. Exactly what was an expression of modesty in Mea Shearim, exactly the same practice turns out to be an expression of immodesty in Amsterdam. What attracts people's attention, what focuses people's attention upon you is largely a factor of culture that varies from time to time and place to place. Okay, we understand the basic principles of what is prohibited because of superstition. We have a good definition of superstition, and we know when and where it is prohibited. Now let's take these ideas and apply them to kaparot, to the minhag of kaparas with the chicken before Yom Kippur. I begin with the Rashba. Rashba was probably the single most important. Well, people could argue about who's the most influential, but he's surely one of the most influential poskim in Spain after the Reconquista. He was in the Christian period in Spain after the Reconquista. He was in the 13th century. These are the words of the Rashba. You already know what I have had to say about the kapara, about the chicken practice. It's the young lads who are doing this on Erev Yom Kippur with the chickens. Asati, and you know that I have prohibited it. Mosif Od, and you have, in addition to my having prohibited this practice with the chickens, you add and say, Karov lamasha shchita psula. After doing this with the chicken is slaughtered, and the shchita is pasul, invalid. Why is the shchita invalid, and therefore the meat is prohibited? Why is the shchita prohibited? Why is the shchita invalid? Because after all, slaughtering an animal as a korban, as a sacrificial animal outside the Beis Hamikdash is prohibited. And anyone who does that, anyone who slaughters a korban, a sacrificial animal outside of the Beis Hamikdash, not only are you prohibited from doing that, but if someone does it, the shechita is invalid and the meat is prohibited. You're not allowed to eat that. And why do people do this with the chicken? Because they think this is part of their kapara process. They think this is part of tshuva. They think this is going to grant them atonement. In other words, they think that the chicken is going to function exactly like a korban, and therefore the shechita is invalid. Oh, not only did the Rashba prohibit the practice, but I don't know who the Rashba was talking to here, but whoever the interlocutor is, whoever asked the question, is proposing that b'diavad, the meat should be asur also. Ani matzati minhag zeh pashut b'irenu. In my city, he lived in Barcelona. In my city, the practice of kaparas is pashut, widespread. Right? In modern Hebrew, pashut means simple or easy. But ani poshet et hayad, I extend the hand. In rabbinic Hebrew, a minhag pashut is a minhag which is extended, which is widespread. In this city, the practice of kaparas is widespread, pashut. They do other strange things like this also. Whenever a boy gets born, they slaughter an old rooster. Cut off the head of the rooster. Whenever a boy is born, you shecht an old rooster, cut off its head, hang up the head by the feathers next to the door to the house where the boy was born, together with some garlic. All of this is prohibited. It's just imitative. It's just an imitation of Gentile ways. It's an imitation of silly, unreasonable, irrational Gentile ways, and therefore prohibited for us because it's a superstitious act. I pushed against this a lot. I tried to get the people to stop doing these silly things. And Baruch Hashem, the people listened to me and stopped these silly practices, these superstitious practices. Nothing is left of these stupid practices in my city. People have reported to me, people who are quite reliable have reported to me, Ashkenaz, that in Germany, Jews which came from Germany and are studying in our Beis Midrash here in Spain have reported to me, Shekol Rabbanei Artsam, all the rabbis in their country, in Germany, in the Middle Ages, Osim came, they're doing it with the chickens around the head and slaughtering it. All the rabbis are doing it in Germany. Arve Yom Kippurim, they're doing it just before Yom Kippur. Shohatim lekapara avazim tarnagolim, they are taking the chickens and the avazim, the geese, whirling them around the head and slaughtering them. Gam shamati ki nishal Rav Hai Gaon Zal. And I've also been told that Rav Hai Gaon, the great Rav of Babylonia, in that period between the end of the Gemara and the beginning of the Rishonim, the great Rav of Babylonia, one of the direct descendants, one of the Talmidim of the great rabbis of the Gemara, he also did it. Amashake Nahagu, and in Babylonia they were also doing it, presumably since Talmudic times, surely in post-Talmudic times. Im kol zeh manatya minagazem irenu. Despite all this, I canceled the practice in my city, and no one is doing it here. Okay, what do we have? According to the Rashba, the whole practice of kaparot is simply prohibited because it is silly and because it is merely an imitation of non-Jewish ways. On the other hand, he recognizes that there are rabbis, for example, in early Middle Ages in Babylonia, contemporary rabbis of his in the High Middle Ages in Germany who are actually doing it. Therefore, this is a subject which is apparently subject to controversy. What one person, namely the Rajma, thinks of as being silly and baseless and therefore prohibited, other rabbis, for example, those in Germany and in Babylonia, think otherwise and therefore not only permit it, but are doing it themselves. Okay, that's the Spanish view of things. Now let's look at the Ashkenaz view of things. The from France in the High Middle Ages. Here we have the Ashkenaz view. Nahagu kol Yisrael erev Yom Kippurim lasot kapara al zeh seder. All Jews, well, at least in France in those days, all Jews are doing the minhag of kaparot on the day before Yom Kippur, and this is exactly the procedure. Here comes the procedure. Lochim tarnagol shenikra gever. You take a chicken, which the other word for chicken is there. Mevi'im oto lezakein lechasid bal kavana. You bring the chicken to a wise elder or a pious person, someone who knows the secrets of Kabbalah. Yakifu saviv rosh mitkaper pa'amayim. The chicken gets whirled around the head of the person who is seeking atonement twice. Two circles around the head. Yohar, and the person who is whirling the chicken says, Zeh tachat zeh, this in place of this, as the chicken should die rather than the person we are atoning for. Zeh tmurat zeh, this in place of this, the chicken should be punished, become a sacrificial, should be sacrificed instead of the human seeking kapara. Zeh hiluf zeh, zeh instead of the one instead of the other. Yetzei tarnagol zeh lamita, let this chicken die, and it would be slaughtered in the proper way. Nichnas ploni ben ploni l'chayim v'lo l'mavet, and so, the son or so, the daughter of so, shall be spared and should live. Well, according to the Orchos Chaim, everyone in France, everyone in Ashkenaz territory in the High Middle Ages was doing it. And quite clearly, they were doing it for kapara in order to attain atonement and to shift their sins onto the chicken. Yomer psukim elu, and then you repeat the following psukim, three verses. Evilim mederech pisham avnosehem yisanu kol ochel tisav nafsham v'yagil ad shavei mavis yizaku el Hashem b'tzar lahem b'tzukosehem yoshi'em yishlach tevarav yirpehem yimalet meshchitatam yodu Hashem chazdu niflotav l'vnei adam. You receive these. That's the correct practice according to the Orchos Chaim. Not only is it permitted, but that's what everyone does, and that's what you should do for kapara. So we see some tension here between the Sephardic authorities, dead set against it, and the Ashkenaz authorities who are actually doing it. Let's go one step further. After going through the procedure, the Orchos Chaim says, "Shochetet hatarnagolet," then you slaughter the animal in the ritual way. Makifu al rosh mitkaper shalosh pamim, and once it's been slaughtered, you whirl it around the head of the person seeking atonement another 3 times. Right, first it was 2 times while it was alive. Now it's 3 times after the shechita. Omar, and you say, Zeh tachat zeh, zeh chiluv zeh, zeh tachtav, zeh temurato, zeh chilufo. The chicken should replace the human for the punishment, for the sins which the human did. It's the chicken which is sacrificed and not the person. The person should live, the chicken is dead. Every time, for every circle around the head, you say, Lahagid la'adam yosho v'chananu v'yomar p'dayehu meredet shachas matzati kofe. Those are the verses to say after you have done it. Mishalchim atarnagolet l'misha nachon lo. After you've completed the whole process, by now the chicken's dead, right? It was slaughtered in between the first 2 times and the second 3 times. Now the slaughtered chicken you send to someone who has no food prepared, someone who's poor and doesn't have any food for the Suda Mafsekis, or for eating after Yom Kippur. You send the chicken to a poor person, Kedei Lasot Tzedakah. That would be an act of tzedakah, fulfilling the verse, tzedakah tatzil memavet, an act of charity will save you. Ramban Zal, Oseh minhag zeh mishum darchei amori. The Orchis Hayab knows full well that the Sephardic poskim on the other side of the Pyrenees are prohibiting this, and not only the Ramban, but the Rajba. Well, that's on that side of the Pyrenees in Spain. They prohibit the whole thing. Here in Ashkenaz, we are doing it. Well, at least that was the situation in the High Middle Ages. Let's go down a little bit more closer to modern times. The Pri Chodesh was Rav De Silva, was his name. That family name is not well known in yeshiva circles, although the Sefer is very important. He's always just called the Pri Chodesh. He's known by the name of his Sefer. He was in Turkey in early modern times, end of the 17th century. And this is what he has to say. Masha nohagim lasot kapara be'erev Yom Kippurim lishchot tarnagol. This practice used in Turkey, which is Sephardic territory, the practice of slaughtering a chicken on Erev Yom Kippur, yesh limnoa haminhag. One should block the practice, one should cancel that practice. Kasher tuva, this business is very difficult. This business of slaughtering a chicken before Yom Kippur is very difficult. Kasher ma'od. Chad. First reason, how is it possible to shift one's sins onto a chicken? The idea just doesn't make any sense. Hatanan, it says in the Gemara, Lo sha'adam rashai lahamir. It says in the Gemara that even a korban, if you have a real korban, if the Beis Hamikdash, you designate one of your animals, this cow is going to be my korban in the Beis Hamikdash, the Torah, the Mishnah says flat out, you're not allowed to exchange one korban for another. Well, if the Mishnah flat out prohibits exchanging one korban for another, then how are you supposed to exchange your sins for the chicken? It just doesn't make any sense. Oh, furthermore, halotanan, did we not learn in the Gemara? Ofot einosin tamura. Chickens are not valid for korbanot. There are no korbanot, which are chickens. A chicken is not valid for kapara. Even if somehow it were some kind of korban, you can't be a chicken. Furthermore, how is it possible to say that this person's sins should be transferred onto this chicken? Hello, Mishnah Shleimah, doesn't it say flat out in the Mishnah, Ein zet tamura? You cannot shift sins from one person to another. Well, Ein safek sheraui levatel minhag mishum darchei amori. Of course, it's all just a superstitious practice, imitative of non-Jewish conduct. And of course, it should be eliminated. Ksiv, it says in the Torah, Tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha, follow the mitzvahs of the Torah, and that's all HaKadosh Baruch Hu requires you to do. And this kapara business is not one of the mitzvahs of the Torah. It's just a silly Gentile practice, and we should not do it. Well, it's not surprising, is it, that in early modern times, the Sephardic opinion, dead set against kaparas, is still in effect. And if you're interested, I give you a long list of Gaonim from Babylonia, the Sharei Tshuva, Rav Shashna, Rav Natranai Gaon, Rav Hai Gaon. I give you a long list of Gaonim from Babylonia who were actually doing the minhag of kaparas. And this is historically very important for the following reason. The Jews of Spain, how did the Jews get to Spain? The Jews came to Spain from North Africa. How did the Jews come to North Africa? The Jews came to North Africa from Babylonia. From the Babylonian point of view, North Africa was a Jewish colony. There's the Jews in North Africa colonized, the Jews in Babylonia colonized North Africa. The direction of migration was from Babylonia to North Africa up into Spain. Ashkenaz Jews, on the other hand, where did the Jews come from in France, Germany, and Eastern Europe? How did they get there? Well, they came there from Italy. That's perfectly clear. The Colonimus family was one of the first families to move from Italy up into France. That was the beginning of a movement, the movement of Italian Jews, first into France and then eastward into Germany and into Eastern Europe, had its origins in Italy. How did the Jews get to Italy? And the Jews came to Italy from Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah talks quite a number of times about the Jews in Rome, the Jews in Italy. From the Roman point of view, what they called Palestine was a Roman province. From the Jewish point of view, the Jews in Italy were a colony of Eretz Yisrael. Now, it follows, therefore, that Ashkenaz Jews have their historical roots in Eretz Yisrael. Sephardic Jews have their historical roots in Babylonia. And indeed, wherever there are conflicts between the Babylonian and the Yerushalmi Talmud, in almost every case, the Ashkenazim are following the opinions of the Yerushalmi, and almost in every case, the Sfaradim are following the opinions of the Bavli. It's the Babylonian wisdom which made its way into Spain, and the Eretz Yisrael wisdom which made its way into France and Germany. Yes, Jody.
Sorry, just a bit of an ignorant question. But the Jews came to Rome, that was through the Roman occupation. They were sent there, they went there, they were taken there. How did they go?
Before the destruction of the Second Temple, there were commercial ties between Italy and Eretz Yisrael. And although it is not known who the original Jewish settlers in Italy were, almost surely they were merchants. As soon as the community there began to grow, then Rabbanim all of a sudden start appearing in Rome. Chachmei Roma are mentioned not rarely in the Mishnah and in Midrashic period. That's even before Churban Habayis. Of course, after the destruction of the Second Temple, a large number of Jews were enslaved and forcibly brought to Italy. But that's later. Eventually, they migrated in the beginning around the 9th century. they began migrating north into France. And as I mentioned, the Colonimus family, Grossman is the historian who did most of the work tracing the original families who moved, Jewish families who moved from Italy up into France.
Thanks.
Okay, machlokas between the Sfaradim and the Ashkenazim. These have their roots in Eretz Israel. Those have their roots in Babylonia, which makes the Sephardic practice somewhat surprising, because in Babylonia, here's a long list of Babylonian Gaonim who, in fact, were doing the practice of kaparot. One would expect that to find its way into Spain, but it didn't. The Spanish rabbis rejected it. And although in the Yerushalmi, although in Eretz Israel, there were no sources for kaparot, nonetheless, it became popular in Ashkenaz territory, just the opposite of what one expect. What one would expect, not in every case, are the Ashkenazim following Eretz Yisrael practices, and not in every case are the Sephardic Jews following Babylonian practices, where there's a disagreement between them. There are a few exceptions, and this is one of them. Let's go one step further and see what the Shulchan Aruch has to say about this. Here's the text of the Shulchan Aruch, written by Reb Yosef Karo, one of the all-time great Sephardic authorities. The name of the section of the Shulchan Aruch is Min HaKaparot Be'erev Yom HaKippurim, the practice of kaparot. Minhag shel shtus, it's stupid. Those are the words of the Shulchan Aruch. Minhag shel shtus. Ma shenoagim lasot kapara be'erev Yom HaKippurim, this practice of slaughtering a chicken before Yom Kippur, I'll call Ben Zachar v'lomed ala psukim, and people recite verses. Yesh lemnoah haminhag. This should all be prohibited. It's just stupid. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Well, it's not surprising that the Shulchan Aruch, Reb Yosef Karo, is following in the footsteps of a large number of great Sephardic authorities. What about the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ashkenaz annotator of the Shulchan Aruch? Well, he wrote in his Hagah, in his note on this halacha, Yesh me'agaonim shekatvu minhag zeh. Some of the Gaonim from Babylonia mention this as being a kosher practice, a recommended practice. And many more recent poskim, like the Orchos Chaim that we saw earlier on the screen, approve of it. And it is the practice in all of these areas, in Ashkenaz territory. He was in Poland when he wrote this. This is indeed the practice in all Ashkenaz territory. Ein l'shanot. One should not deviate from this practice. Because it's a valid minhag, and it is a tikkun, it is a valid way of attaining kapara, attaining atonement before Yom Kippur. For males, you take a rooster. Women take females take a chicken. Male for male, female for female. Pregnant women take two, one rooster and one a chicken, not knowing the gender of the baby they're carrying. Maybe it's going to be a boy. I mean, the woman is surely going to have a chicken for herself, but she should add a rooster because she might be carrying a boy. Bochrim Tarnagolim Levanim. And of course, we choose white roosters or white chickens. As it says in the verse, as it says in the verse, your sins will be turned white, will be purified. Well, that's why we have white chickens or white roosters for this procedure. The slaughtered chickens are then given to poor people, liftoton mamamun, or one. If you want to eat the chicken yourself, you take its value in cash and give the cash to the poor people, and then you can eat the chicken yourself if you want. According to the Ramah, that's the minhag. Ashkenaz authorities are fully in favor of this. I have here somewhere, here's an image which I took from the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch, printed in Venice in 1725. This was the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch. You'll notice it has only the text written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. The notes added later by the Ashkenaz posuk have not yet been added. And of course, there are no commentaries. This was the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch. I first encountered this when I was curious in establishing a specific text, the correct text in the Evane Ezra section dealing with marriage and divorce. Now, I was in the Library of Congress at the time, and I ordered the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch from the Library of Congress to check out the correct reading. The Sefer was delivered to me, and I opened up the title page to be sure that I had the correct first edition in front of me. And I could not help but notice that the decorative motif surrounding the title page was a decorative motif added around the title page, images of women not wearing any clothing at all. And I said to myself, my, oh my, is this the decorative motif because this volume of the Shulchan Aruch is dealing with marriage and divorce? Let me order the other volumes and check them out. I ordered up the other 3 volumes, and indeed, exactly the same decorative appears in all 4 volumes of the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch. Well, this is easy enough to explain. Rabbi Yosef Karo was not in Italy. He was in Eretz Israel. He did not personally supervise the printing, and the artist who designed and executed the woodcut. Right, we're talking about movable type. So the text was set in lead movable type, but the title page was done in a woodcut, a decorative woodcut. And the artist who did the woodcut for the decoration on the title page, he was not Jewish, and he did a similar decorative motif, similar to other Renaissance books which were being published in those days. In any event, you can see in the text of the original Shulchan Aruch is exactly the way we have it today. Masha nohagim lasot kapara. Be'erev Yom HaKippurim, l'shchot tarnegolet, al kol ben zachar, v'lomed ala psukim, yesh limnoa min hagahu. This must be prohibited. And the title of the siman, min ha'kaparot be'erev Yom Kippurim, min hag shel shtus hu, is all silly and therefore prohibited under the rubric of non-Jewish superstitious activities. Those then are your basic sources. I'm going to pause at this time and wish you a good week and eventually a good Shabbos. And next week we'll continue with topics having to do with Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. If you have specific issues which you want to be addressed, feel free to send me an email suggesting a topic. Here's my email. There on chat, you have my email. If you want to suggest a specific topic, I'll be happy to include it in the curriculum. So I wish you then a good week and a good Shabbos, and look forward to seeing you all again next week. Yeah, sure, you can ask a question.
Ancillary question.
Okay.
Was there, you've pretty much answered all the others. Was there any particular reason you were looking for to see the first printing? Just was there?
There's one seif in Hilchos Gerushim where the commentaries are very unhappy with what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, and they suggest that maybe the text is wrong, maybe the printer made a mistake, and I wanted to see what was in the first edition. And indeed, indeed, there was a mistake in the Shulchan Aruch. The commentaries identified that correctly.
Amazing. Thanks.
Okay.
Really, really helpful. Very interesting.
Okay. Do you have other questions for now?
I feel a little.
I just want to say that
Yes,
when I
Nechama.
switched, when I lived in Spot and I did the Kapora, instead of taking money and whirling it around, it was an incredible difference for me. That every time a chicken was killed, I actually felt it. So I don't know about the people who did it, who do it, but I don't think it's foolish. It actually makes you really look into something deeper.
Okay, you have revealed your Ashkenaz background,
Right.
because it's the Ashkenaz poskim who think that it's reasonable and encourage it.
Right.
To this day, don't do it.
Okay, well, it has recently become popular among Sfaradim. Now that Sfaradim and Ashkenazim are mixed together in the same communities, there's been a lot of transfer back and forth. Ashkenazim have started doing a lot of Sephardic things, and Sfaradim have started doing a lot of Ashkenaz things. So it has made some penetration into Sephardic communities as well.
Is that problematic? If their
Indeed.
minhag clearly says they should.
Indeed, their rabbis are not happy with it. But
Mm.
then Ashkenaz rabbis are not happy with some Sephardic practices that Ashkenazim seem to be adopting as well. Oh, this would be an important topic for a class after the Yamim Tovim, after Tishrei.
What, Sephardim and Ashkenazim minhagim?
Yes, taking minhagim of the other team. That would be a good topic to discuss later in the year.
That, or shall I?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to remember, Rav Fink. Are you going to remember or me?
One of my big problems in life is that I have too many thoughts. Just the opposite of Albert Einstein. Robert Oppenheimer, a colleague of Einstein, once recommended to him, said, Albert, why don't you keep a notebook where every time you have an idea, you write it down? To which Einstein responded, but I have so few ideas. And it's true. In his whole lifetime, he had around 5 new ideas. Each one happened to be monumentally important, but he really only had five new ideas in the course of his life. But each one was so revolutionary and monumentally important. But he didn't have a lot of eye on the other hand. It was scatterbrained. And my mind is constantly filled with ideas. So I could forget.
Okay.
We'll remind
okay.
you. We'll remind you.
Have a good day. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're
Nice
welcome.
to
You're
see you.
welcome.
So much.
You're welcome.